Despite being 43 days in contravention of the collective agreement with confidence and abundance, by letter dated June 9, 2015, QIIT advises me that they require my collaboration. In legal terms, that means we're doing nothing for you if you don't cooperate. What's the motivation? Who's the beneficiary? Pull on that thread. I did pull on that thread. I filed a grievance against Supersea and QIIT for failure to respond to my workplace harassment complaints. At the time of its filing, I provided all parties, including the Tribunal Administrative du Travail, copies of my audio recorded evidence. About a month later, I received a notice of hearing. I said to myself, what's going on here? These lawyers and judges know I didn't provide them my audio recorded evidence out of the goodness of my heart. The Quebec Court of Appeal requires that all parties receive audio recorded evidence prior to a hearing as the first step to its admittance into evidence. That's basic knowledge for organizations with law clerks. So I asked for a pre-hearing conference to discuss, among other things, evidence admissibility for my audio recordings. So to fully appreciate the hogwash you're going to hear from an administrative tribunal responsible for setting labor law in the province of Quebec, you need a crash course in evidence admissibility. A witness normally submits evidence verbally or accompanied by documents. However, in the province of Quebec, video and audio recordings have their own special category. Admitting audio recordings into evidence is governed by the Quebec Civil Code and is subjected to a mandatory authentication criteria. All courts and tribunals in Quebec are obligated to apply this criteria. If Article 2858 is not complied with in a separate hearing before the parties give evidence before a judge, the recorded element under Article 2858 will be rejected as inadmissible. It's the judge's obligation to schedule a separate hearing to determine authenticity once a party notifies the court of its intention to admit audio recordings into evidence. In attendance were myself, Judge Andre Marchot, Mike Cohen, lawyer for QIIT, and Yves Girard, lawyer for Supersea.
Now watch the bouncing ball.
What is the decision on the, is there going to be an objection to the recorded evidence? Because there's a procedure involved for that, if there's an objection. Because as I understand, it's the commission has to deal with the issue regardless of whether it's an objection.
You will submit your documents, your statement of facts. If there's an objection raised by Mike Cohen or by Mr. Girard, you will know when they respond.
But my understanding is that the commission has to deal with it anyway, regardless of an objection.
They deal with it anyway. What do you mean?
The commission has to address the issue of the recordings regardless of an objection. Is that correct or not?
I won't listen to the recording.
No, I understand that.
There is no objection. Of course, you understand that. So all the action that will be taken by the court will be after you exchange all those your statement of facts to see if there's an objection raised or not in regards to those documents.
But my question is, my understanding is that the commission has to, regardless whether the respondents object to the admissibility, the commission has the obligation to address the issue of the recordings, as my understanding.
Of course. You
and that's
intend
a process in itself.
Mr. Simon, you intend to submit it. We'll see if there's an objection or not. If there's no objection, of course, the judge will listen to the recording. If there's an objection raised, the judge will decide if the objection is granted or not. But you will have the opportunity to plead in regards to that those recordings should be relevant and heard by the judge. And of course, if there's an objection, the judge will hear the opposite position and he will decide.
Okay, so but I just didn't get an answer. My question is, regardless of an objection, does not the commission have an obligation, regardless if the respondents object or not, to address the issue of the admissibility of the recordings?
Will have the obligation to address, of course, and decide if it's admissible or not. But once there's an objection raised or not, I cannot decide right now if it should be admissible or not. I don't know if there's an objection that is raised.
Pause. I could have asked Andre Michaud if he wanted a Big Mac with fries, and I still would have gotten the same non-response. I'm trying to, I don't know, I think we're running in circles. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just saying that it is my understanding, according to the law and commission, and the commission's practice, that regardless of an objection by the respondents, there has to be a decision, some sort of decision from the commission on why or why not the recordings are admissible. Is that correct or not correct?
To explain?
Maybe.
I don't want to be
Please.
And I think it meets your requirement. If we don't object, the commission will not object, and they'll accept to hear the recording, okay? If we do object, and I'm not saying we are going to, then the commission will rule as to whether they can listen to the recording.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, if there's no objection by any of the parties, there's no problem.
Okay.
And if there is an objection, there will be a ruling.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was bullshit. Pure fallacy. Doesn't exist in Quebec law. That's like saying Santa Claus exists. Andre Michaud acquiesced his duties to Mike Cohen. Mr. Cohen has an objection under Article 2855, and any grounds of inadmissibility Andre Michaud has an obligation to consider under Article 2858. These questions are not rhetorical. I wrote you 3 times to clarify and correct the record. Simple questions for a judge, and all I got was... Then you have the confidence to tell me my request for revocation did not conform to reality. Not ending there, you used that confidence to write a final decision that was factually untrue. Yes, you did, Gayton Breton. Right here, paragraph 10, last sentence. It is necessary to mention that both the nature of the evidence and the identity of witnesses are not yet known. Then what was this? It was a humiliating farce, that's what I mean. Do you want to clarify your point on the witnesses are not yet known? Specifically, Andre Michaud deciding only Vincent Dion, Nicolas Lemieux, and Isabelle Laurent will be called as witnesses? How does an impartial judge, out of the blue, by himself, come up with the narrowing of the evidence at a pre-hearing conference that only the defendants will be called as witnesses? From where are Quebec's social institutions getting their confidence?
There's racism in Quebec, but no systematic racism.
So that your answer would be no then?
No.
Oh.
I filed a human rights complaint against my employer, TUAC, and the Tribunal Administrative to Travail. Quebec's Human Rights Commission notified me, the complainant, that it immediately required unspecified further information from me or my complaint would be terminated. That's 2 months and 1 day after its filing. On 2 dates, I wrote to Quebec's Human Rights Commission asking them if they could please put their requirements in a letter to facilitate an accurate record of my complaint process. Since their May 11, 2017 letter, the Quebec Human Rights Commission has not communicated with me. And it started here at Metro Inc. Super C, where I wrote in my human rights complaint, Quebec has weaponized language to distract the uninterested majority from government decision-making policy. Metro Inc. Super C ignored my complaints of racism and discrimination to throw it back in my face, only comparable to history's known worst employers.
It's you, Andrew. It's you in the night.
Yes.
Everything's well.
That's how Metro Inc. Super C speaks to its black employees. Visible minorities need jobs too, and I'm sure there's others like me who are forced to work in hostile work environments. I worked at Metro Inc. Super C for 2 years, and no one ever came to me at bare minimum and said, "Hey, you all right?" Believe me, there's more.
How can you take the high road all the time when someone is just like that?
You suppose you're black. You're black.
That eloquent racism is from Super C store director Luc Palmerville, the same Luc Palmerville who told TUAC's Nicolas Lemieux that I was an aggressive problem employee. I'm rolling my eyeballs right now. While government inaction forces minorities to live with that type of systemic racism on a daily basis, Mr. Legault and other political leaders place their good faith in playing the race card and the victim role to oppose the Liberals' proposed public consultations on systemic racism. But still, the Quebec politicians continue to tell visible minorities what they need to do to not be discriminated against. You can't make this stuff up.
On présente un projet de loi qui nomme 3 plans d'action concrets. Le premier plan pour sensibiliser le public à la discrimination. Le deuxième plan pour améliorer l'intégration et la francisation. Et un troisième plan pour lutter contre l'analphabétisme.
No acknowledgement, no denial of any government policies or programs that may contribute to discriminating against visible minorities. That's rich. That's the old boys club, the powerful refusing the vulnerable's request to autopsy the structure the institutions were originally built on. That's how we got the Valorization Diversity Fight Discrimination Forum. Just get a job, nothing else to see here. I assume it looks like Metro Inc. Super C's boardroom. Metro Inc. Super C, if you're upset believing I'm painting a defamatory picture, then explain to us, what did you do with my racism and harassment complaints? Because I am an example.
Andrew, it's you, Andrew. It's you in the night.
Yes.
Everything's well.
For the Liberal Party, it was a matter of waiting for an opportunity to publicly regret their decision to hold public consultations on systemic racism. Opportunity knocked when the Liberals lost the by-election in the constituency of Louis-Hébert, Quebec. And they went straight to the pulpit.
We should cancel this commission today and end all unfair accusations against Quebecers.
Kathleen Weil was replaced by David Hertel. Hertel cancels the systemic racism hearings. He organizes a one-day job fair and suggests that visible minorities should put on rose-colored sunglasses.
We want to take this conversation that we need to have collectively as a society with Quebecers of all origins and see how we can do better on this issue and look at it through the prism of job creation.
Pardon me, a rose-colored prism. You may have been thinking that I was pushing the limit. Now you're sure that I've crossed the line, but I stress, read between the lines. Not only do we have to read between the lines, we have to watch for the shell game. First, Quebec City's Le Soleil succinctly explains the Liberal Party's capitulation. Second, at the Diversity Forum, Mr. Couillard explains that systemic racism is actually immigrants not being shoveled into Quebec fast enough.
This is the main economic challenge of Quebec, even more than the free trade disputes with the US, Mr. Trump and associated elements. This question of the shortage of our workforce is directly threatening the existence of many of our companies, particularly in our regions.
Lastly, what all politicians rely on, voters' lack of memory retention.
Mr. Couillard, if elected, will you set up an inquiry into systemic racism in Quebec, yes or no?
No, because we asked the people.
Okay,
and they
this must say
come on,
yes
I
or
need
no.
to explain that to me. I cannot just
no,
say
we're
no
just
for
going
this.
for a yes or no answer. I'm
Because
sorry.
it's a complex issue. You just
Yes,
cannot
it is.
answer by yes,
it
or
is,
no.
and I
It
agree.
makes sense.
Yes, racism is a complex issue. No, it made complete sense to immigrants. Mr. Couillard made a self-serving decision to provide this demographic the equivalency of a notwithstanding veto on discussions on how social institutions are appropriating constitutional rights to immigrants based solely on 91.3% majority subjective feelings. Rich. One would assume that Quebec's visible minorities can rely on the province's Human Rights Tribunal to address their systemic racism complaints, but since its creation in 1990, it has never heard a systemic racism complaint. I'm not trying to shock you. That's what's expected when the Quebec National Assembly, populated with members like the aforementioned, appoint the president of the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal and the president of the Quebec Human Rights Commission. Human rights adjudicators have an obligation to identify and eliminate discriminatory behavior. The Quebec Human Rights Commission sends out a press release touting the need to find concrete solutions to systemic racism and the necessity to study its impact, pushing a narrative that contradicts their boss's refusal to acknowledge systemic racism. They're studying the impact, while the Supreme Court of Canada has already said the impact is on human dignity. The Quebec Human Rights Commission says it is searching for concrete solutions with no permission from their bosses to turn over stones, and I got a video of public institutions happily applying the rules disproportionately. To people offended by my phrase weaponized language, let me put that in real life terms. November 23rd, 2016, my store manager, Edward Morales, and department manager, Christopher Wade, brought me into the office weeks after a customer complaint. No details provided to me about the circumstances, just do you remember?
Okay, so what was it about? C'est parce que la cliente, elle a demandé d'être servie en français. Puis, tu lui as parlé juste en anglais.
What happened?
What happened is there's a client that came in and asked you a question, and she said that she wanted to be served in French, and you talked to her in English.
All right.
Okay. Donc, est-ce que tu te rappelles de ça? Do you remember all that? No? That's my client.
Eduardo and Chris repeated to me Bill 101.
There's a law in Quebec that says that if you hire someone, that person has to speak French and English.
I wasn't happy throughout my entire employment, selective law enforcement. But Chris stressed to me, Andrew, this is coming straight from the top, head office.
If you're going to call me in for something sham like that, I want to find out what happened about that thing.
Andrew, it's not a thing about, it's not him that's it. This has come from the Bureau Chef.
Well, you asked the Bureau Chef. I'm being serious too, because there's something not going on right around here.
Upon his installation as our new store director, Eduardo Morales refused my request to determine why the collective agreement was not applied in my circumstances. I asked him again.
What's the secret? I'd like to find out why I was disciplined. I'm asking you why I was disciplined. And I want to find out why I was sent home that day. And we need to talk about why that's, because there's some secret that's going on around here.
Okay.
So can you please find out? You're not going to find out? You're my director, I'm asking you. So you don't want to do it? No, well, you need to find out. Right. Who should I ask? Okay. So you're not going to do it? Why? All right. Why?
Do you hear the hate in their voices? Do you hear the manipulation of my bosses? That's the real life application of Bill 101. Very few people came into that store and said, hey, where are you from? Welcome to Quebec. It was like they had no desire to understand there's something outside the 1.6 million square kilometers. It was just speak French and then add color on top of that.
I hear clients come in the store. Gossip, that's exactly it. There's clients that come and see me too. There are clients that come and see me and say, I'm trying to back you. I'm saying
we have some racist clients here, and
no, that's it. We're not like that. I believe you 100%.
And the amount of
Francois Legault, do you know how many times Super C told me that I needed to show understanding to proud racists because their money was more important than my dignity? I'm talking to you, Premier Legault. Guess how many times Super C permitted racist customers to treat me in a discriminatory manner and legitimize their hatred based on a language law? Guess how many times Super C management told me.
So we have some racist clients here, and
no, that's it. We're not like that. I believe you 100%. No, that's it. We're not like that. I believe you 100%.
And the amount of
I can make a remix. Billboard, number 1. Do you know the owners of Super C? Could you call them up and ask them to provide me a response as to why they were silent to my complaints of racism in a hostile workplace? While you're at it, ask TUAC. And where do these social institutions get their confidence from? The old double standard. Immigrants need rigorous scrutiny.
Or, je regarde la sélection des groupes et j'ai trouvé avec étonnement la Fédération des Canadiens musulmans et la Fédération musulmane canadienne. C'est soit un manque de rigueur, soit un biais clair pour antagoniser les positions.
Immigrants are required to show good faith.
This person will become in the same position as a worker with a temporary permit that is expired. Then it becomes the responsibility of the federal government. He became or she became an illegal.
Providing his constituents permission to label immigrants as illegals for not learning French, that's Mr. Legault's governing strategy. Lipstick on a pig, that's Mr. Legault's 3-year plan. Everything is correct about learning French. When in Rome, do as the Romans. But to pass off an ultimatum as an immigration policy that has been habitually recycled as a response to immigrant minorities' decades-long request for a provincial discussion on systemic racism and discrimination is disingenuous at best to systemic racism's very definition. Premier Legault, why don't you do visible minorities a favor like you did SNC-Lavalin? Call up the Quebec Human Rights Commission and ask them what's going on with my systemic racism complaint, because as I read it, politicians are quick to take money from and provide relief to those accused of criminal activities. You told us what your position is. If people can afford it, put some money on the table to get out of criminal wrongdoing. Politicians, police, justice officials are bending over backwards to provide criminal relief to wealthy patrons accused of systemic corruption, while Quebec's visible minorities are being chewed up as inconsequential, as their systemic racism complaints are deliberately left unaccounted because they have no money and they have no power. That's institutional racism. Quebec's visible minorities are up against the institutional brick wall that protects the jobs of racist police officers rather than safeguarding the dignity of unfairly treated residents, which makes it quite disingenuous and tiresome to hear Quebec police officials push the same narrative, one of surprise, to hear, for example, that the city of Val-d'Or police degrade Indigenous people in their custody. I am one example in the iceberg of Montreal police misconduct complaints. First Nations and Inuit people make up 2% of Quebec's population. Half of all allegations of police misconduct brought to Quebec's Bureau of Independent Investigations are from Indigenous complainants. The Liberals capitulated on their proposed systemic discrimination consultations by simply passing off the consultations as an inconvenience for Quebecers fed up with being called racist. Liberal Michel Matt said that the systemic discrimination consultations were not what his constituents were talking about, which makes François Legault's assertion,
Quebec, but no systematic racism.
So that your answer would be no then? Oh.
reality for Quebec's 85.2% majority who are uninterested in how their police forces force-feed racism to the province's 2% Indigenous and Inuit population. There's little doubt that the Public Security Minister's report on the Montreal Police's internal affairs was thrown into the poo bell.
That's not my word. Don't put word in my mouth. I said that he's gonna close the file.
Quebec's politicians demonstrate no urgency in determining whether their social institutions operate as delinquent organizations. Rather, they continue their chokehold on immigrants whose complaints of discrimination are the barometer of systemic racism's depths in Quebec's social institutions.
Is this stressful to hear you speak about immigration the way you do it? Submitting people to testing which is not needed. Threatening them and their families with expulsion.
That's right.
Threatening them with expulsion.
Incredible.
And if they don't, what is incredible?
This.
Threatening them and their families with expulsion.
That's right. That's right.
They find all the time in the world concocting ways to Trojan horse visible minorities into marginalization. You may not agree with me that there's institutional racism in Quebec, but if you believe you've been unjustly dragged before a judge, I'll bet the ranch you'll encourage me to find out under what program the Quebec Ministry of Justice offers unreasonable delays, and all you have to do is sit on your ass waiting for time to run out. Because we, the people, are going to get to the bottom of how many civil servants it takes to allocate public services disproportionately. And if it takes a thread, so be it. All this information is readily available at your fingertips, Mr. Legault. Let all Quebecers enjoy some good faith. On the subject of good faith, Mr. Legault, you can call up Valerie Plante and have her inform the public who is the continuing, right AG, continuing beneficiary of that officer's abusive and discriminatory conduct in my home. Oh, and while you're at it, you can release a copy of that 911 call. We've had enough. I'm sure the Montreal police found it all highly entertaining, and they won't mind recounting what they wrote in their reports. Here's her badge number.
En français?
What's your
Toi, c'est quoi ton nom?
Can I have your badge number?
C'est quoi ton nom, toi?
Can I have your badge
Où est ton nom? Je te donne mon nom, pourquoi tu me donnes pas ton nom?
Can I have your badge
Pourquoi
number,
tu me donnes
please?
pas ton nom, toi?
Andrew Simon. Can I have your badge number, please?
Oh mon Dieu, tu l'as dit dans le 6-2?
What is that?
6-2.
Could you write it down, please?
Ben 6.
I don't know it,
Tu parles
ma'am.
en français, ok, ça va faire le niaisage. On s'en va. 6-2-1-1.
I don't know.
T'es venu au poste, tu parles en français. C'est juste du niaisage, là.
Ouais.
Tu t'appelles pour absolument rien, tu parles en français, puis tu veux même pas faire l'effort. Puis après, tu veux que moi je fasse l'effort, tu comprends? T'es venu au poste, on te connaît.
Excuse me, ma'am. I don't understand what you're saying.
Là, tu rappelles pas aujourd'hui mon nom, ok?
Excuse me? Yeah? Thank you very much. Montreal's finest. What'd she call me? Ladies and gentlemen, that's what's called systemic. So, You're going to answer the easy questions. You're going to explain the 911 call. Your attorney general is going to explain why is it taking over a year for an assault charge to go to court. What's the motivation? Who's the beneficiary? This is your pit. Cover up rather than clean house. If shame won't influence Montreal Police's decision making, maybe fame will.